Well, good morning from St. Bart's in Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and it is my joy and delight to welcome you, whether you're here in person in the building or watching us online, to the forum where each week we hold sacred conversations about the things that matter. And I do apologize for starting just a few minutes late this morning. We had blessing of the animals at the 9 o'clock service, which took us a little over our normal time limit. Today, as we recognize St. Francis, who of course was incredibly committed to living a life of intentional poverty and to economic justice, we are delighted to have with us Miguel Escobar, who is the author of a new book, The Unjust Steward, Wealth, Poverty, and the Church Today. Miguel serves as the Executive Director of Anglican Studies at Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary, Uptown. Miguel, it's really wonderful to have you here. Thanks for coming to the forum.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to speak with everyone, and particularly on St. Francis Day, who had a lot to say about wealth and poverty and, as you said, economic justice. I thought I could begin by introducing myself and maybe just trying to situate myself and my family. This is my family and my beautiful parents, who are like kind of movie star-esque, I think. I am the little guy on the very left, as you can see, with the red bow tie. And family really informs and shaped my writing of this book. I am the son and grandson of seasonal migrant farm workers. So both my parents grew up in San Antonio's West Side, were pulled out of school early, returned late in the year, they picked crops in places like Krakow, Wisconsin, and Houston. And their stories and perspective, and those of my grandparents, really informed my views on wealth and poverty. One really critical story, which I talk about in the first chapter, is about my maternal grandfather's death. He died of skin cancer. And skin cancers and cancers are very prevalent within migrant farm working communities, in part because of the pesticides exposure there. So this image is actually of someone looking up. This is based on a memory from my father, who was working in fields outside of Houston, and he remembers crop dusters flying over and directly dropping pesticides on their skin. So this is a very, very common story, the story of cancer, a certain amount of fatalism toward cancer, and it really, really shaped my own experience of thinking about wealth and poverty and sort of where my family fits into this perspective. When I was then in high school, that's when I really fell in love with the Gospels. And one of the reasons why I fell in love with it is because the world of the Gospels actually sounds so much like the world that was described by my family around the kitchen table. This is a world of landowners, of stewards, of people in debt bondage, working fields, day laborers. Darmeen McCullough, who's a very eminent historian, writes that the world of the Gospels, the Gospels share a lot of similarities with other forms of Greek texts, but they're unusual in that it's the poor who are centered. It's the wealthy and the beautiful are not the center of the story of the Gospels. And so in order to understand even the Gospels, we have to enter into that world. These images, by the way, are not of fields very far away from us. They're actually of the North Fork, Long Island. As a seminary, I took students out to the North Fork, onto the vineyards where maybe some of us have gone and done wine tours. This is a different kind of wine tour where actually we were in the fields. with the migrant farm laborers. And I want you to know that we were warned to not touch the wires, not touch any of the vines because of the amount of pesticides that are there. And in some of these images, you'll see folks with gloves and some without. So this is a very ongoing story for all of us. I've always been interested in money, and not just like having money, but actually what is money, and why is it that people are so obsessed with money? I've become very, very interested also in this question of what can money buy and what can money not buy. There are certain things that money can't buy. There's an amazing book on corruption by the writer Sarah Chait, and she has used the myth of Midas recently to talk about what money, basically, what we're trying to make money buy, such as democracy, and that which it can't. So just I'm going to recommend that. Within the Gospels, and in working for the Episcopal Church, I've become very interested in the way that Christianity in particular talks about money, because it's oftentimes in contradiction with some of the messages that we find in the Gospels. So in the Gospels, the historian Helen Rhee notes a very strong tradition that she calls the oppressive rich, pious poor tradition. And it's one in which wealth is inherently evil, as it's the accumulation by the few of what God intended for all. The Gospels say that the sources of wealth matter, and that wealth is oftentimes caused by exploitation and injustice. That wealth should not be offered to God. Unrighteous mammon should be given to the poor. God seeks a reversal of rich and poor. We see that in Luke's Gospel of the Magnificat text, as well as in the Lucan Beatitudes. So Luke says, "Blessed are the rich," but also later, "Woe." Blessed are the poor, rather, and later, "Woe to the rich." There's an emphasis on literal giving away of wealth to the poor as a prerequisite for being a disciple. And Jesus is not imaged as a prudent steward of wealth. Rather, it's promiscuous generosity. It's this beautiful term by Louis Carew, scandalous generosity and economic fellowship with one another. And I think what I want to just sort of remind us in this is that these are statements about wealth and poverty from a very poor context. Jesus himself was very poor, and he was speaking to people who were themselves poor. So they have this view of wealth and poverty that emerges from that place. What I decided to do in this book then is look at 24 different texts over the course of the first 5 centuries of the church, and look at the way in which the church evolved or devolved, depending on your perspective, in how it thinks about wealth and poverty. And so, not to oversimplify the story, but by the end of the 5th century with Augustine, you really have the foundations of how we talk about wealth and poverty today, much more, the church. The church really, that sort of oppressive, rich, pious, poor tradition, it's still there. I put it in very faintly, because it's still kind of, you see it at the margins. We still have monks and nuns. We still have prophetic figures. But I would say the bulk of the church, including at my very, very poor, the church that I go to, which is very low income, the vast majority of us actually all talk about money in these ways, which is that money isn't the root of all evil. It's love of money that is the root of all evil. It's the interiority that we bring to it. Wealth is not inherently bad. Wealth is actually a morally neutral tool. It's like a paintbrush or a hammer. You can use it for one way or another. Wealth and power are God-given for holy use. We don't really talk about sources anymore as much. We talk about being good stewards of that wealth. Wealth from exploitation can be put to holy use. And in a reading of the Unjust Steward, which was a couple of weeks ago in the lectionary, we say that unrighteous mammon should be given to the holy poor. And through Jerome and Augustine, they meant especially monks and nuns. So that moved from the poor to the holy poor. Just note that little sleight of hand. God seeks not reversal, but rather reconciliation between rich and poor, and particularly through philanthropy or through the redemptive almsgiving. So there's an exchange between rich and poor happening. Blessed are the poor, but also blessed are the poor in spirit. So again, emphasizing spiritual humility, spiritual dispossession from one's wealth as a prerequisite to discipleship. I'll probably talk about this later, but the Gospel of Matthew says, if you wish to be perfect, then dispossess yourself of wealth. And the church, even by the 3rd century, was already saying, therefore, that story about the eye of the needle really only applies to monks and nuns. That's how we kind of get out of that requirement for all people. And we move very quickly away from promiscuous generosity and economic fellowship to something like prudent wealth stewardship. So I say this descriptively and hopefully not with like a lot of judgment and moral value. I'm just sort of saying this is sort of where we've moved, and there's this counter tradition which is also there and constantly commenting and constantly sort of trying to pull the church back into another conversation as well. Nevertheless, I think we do have to reflect more deeply. So the Episcopal Church, or the Anglican tradition, has this beautiful line about how we understand the Bible. We say, we do not take the Bible literally, but we do take it seriously. One question that I have is, in terms of the way we talk about wealth today, wealth and poverty, are we actually taking the Bible seriously? Are we taking the Beatitudes seriously? If 3 out of the 4 Gospels tell us in some fundamental way that our wealth inhibits our ability to follow Jesus, at the very least, we need to take a pause and reflect on what that is saying to all of us. In The Unjust Steward, which is the parable, that's the title of this book, it concludes with saying, no servant can serve 2 masters, for either we will hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. And I think, again, this is Jesus speaking primarily to poor people. I think now it's speaking to all of us, and saying that all of us have a choice in life. All of us have to decide who and what we are serving. I think many times, and I'm speaking about myself included, I'm in the service of wealth and power rather than God and the good news to the poor. And I need to really reflect more deeply on how to bring that into more alignment with where God wants me to be. So with that, I'll conclude. It was a fun book to write. I wrote it during the pandemic. And if you want to contact me and have more conversation, there's my email. And I look forward to this talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Miguel. We have plenty of time for questions, and I'm sure there are some. If you're here in person at St. Bart's, there are some question cards on that central table, and my colleague Manny Rodriguez-Leach will help you get one, fill one out, and bring them to me. If you're joining us online, you can put in a question or a comment for Miguel in the live chat function on YouTube, the comments function on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson @stbarts.org. Miguel, since we're gathered on St. Francis Day, I'm wondering, you stopped the book after the first kind of 5 centuries, kind of the so-called patristic period. Can you talk about you say this tradition still exists in the background, and I would say maybe St. Francis is one of those people who
Definitely
carries this tradition on. Can you say something maybe about St. Francis in particular, but also about any other figures in the last 1,500 years that have spoken prophetically about issues of wealth and poverty?
Sure. My favorite story about St. Francis comes from more recently, 2003. My brother and I went to go see a traveling exhibit of Vatican treasures. This was in San Antonio, Texas. And there was this chasuble, which is something that clergy wear. You'll see it later. Probably Peter will be wearing it later. There's a chasuble in a glass case of just like extreme gold thread and pearls. It just looked extremely heavy, right? And I went up and I looked closely at it, and eventually I realized that the images all that gold thread and pearl was making was of St. Francis asking the Pope to found the Mendicant Order in 1210. The rest of it was all images of his life of poverty. And I thought it was endlessly funny. No one else in the room at the moment thought it was very funny. It was a very serious sort of like Vatican, treasure exhibit. And I bring that up because what it really symbolizes for me is the way in which the church embroiders the prophetic witness of people like St. Francis and Jesus. We kind of encrust it in gold. We say it is valuable using the terms that we know the most, which is oftentimes wealth and power. And so we do a really great job of not listening to actually the really difficult things that Francis is saying to the church, and we kind of hide it behind gold and pearls. So that's my favorite memory about St. Francis.
Well, I found it interesting because I sort of, at the semi-last minute, had to preach this weekend, and so I was kind of quickly reading up on Francis and learning and refreshing myself more about his life. And what I thought was really interesting was that even in his life, the people that were most committed to following the way of Francis found it difficult to be as strongly committed to a life of poverty as Francis was, that even before Francis died, they were pushing at the rules and saying, well, maybe we shouldn't take it quite this seriously. And then certainly after Francis dies, you have this, I've been to Assisi, this lavish kind of temple to Francis's memory, in using a kind of language that probably Francis wouldn't have been okay with.
The same thing happened with the Benedictine Rules. So the Benedictine Rule says that individual monks should not own property and should be engaged in manual labor. But there's a loophole there. While the Benedictine Rule speaks about individual property, it doesn't say anything about collective property. And so there are beautiful Benedictine monasteries because no individual monk owns those. And then later there's Jerome who makes the argument that intellectual labor is just as valuable as manual labor, and therefore we move into Benedictine monks being responsible actually for the kind of scripts and texts that we are really the recipients of and kind of value today. So yeah, we're very good at sort of reversing the reversal and kind of ironing out what these prophetic voices say.
Finding the loophole. There's all sorts of explanations of the eye of the needle and being able to kind of explain around that phrase.
And the one that's that's already in place by the end of the 5th century is, so there are 3 versions of the eye of the needle. The Matthean version uses the term if you wish to be perfect, that inserts that little clause. If you wish to be perfect, you must sell all your wealth and then give it to the poor in order to follow me. So already by the 3rd century, and then certainly by the 5th with Augustine, it's understood as a counsel to perfection, and therefore really specifically only for monks and nuns, not for all of us.
I wonder if you can say a little bit more about the parable of the unjust steward, since it does provide the title for your book. You'll be interested to know that it was the assigned lectionary reading a few weeks ago,
Right.
but at St. Bart's we skipped it because we were celebrating St. Bart's Day, and so our readings were for St. Bartholomew. So some folks in the audience may not be as familiar with it since we didn't actually read it recently.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating parable and has long been considered one of Jesus' most complex parables. It is a story of a landowner and a vast estate and his steward, first and foremost. At the very beginning of the story, he accuses his steward of misusing his wealth. And that sets off a whole chain of action. Just to kind of, again, set the landscape a little bit more, this takes place on, a land not so very different than what we're talking about here. It's a vast agricultural estate. There's a landowner who lives off-site. And what you discover through the parable is that the workers are in debt bondage to the landowner. And what the steward does when he is kind of called out for misusing funds is he takes the owner's wealth and uses it to have the debts of the workers. So this is a classic image of God's liberation, having of or the reduction of debts. And then right in the middle, Jesus says that we are called to use even unrighteous mammon, so the wealth of the landowners, wealth of gain through exploitation, in order to make friends among the poor. So ideally, we take unrighteous mammon and use it for good in the world. A line which has always caused a little bit of nervousness because it sounds like Jesus is saying something we should be doing something kind of immoral in this action. And then it is afterwards that he says that we have to choose, as servants, we have to choose what we're serving. Either we're serving wealth or we're serving God. So it's a very complex parable. It's an interesting one in terms of a church that really loves the word stewardship. Stewards in the Gospels are not particularly great characters. They're actually they have the same sort of role and connotation as taskmasters and overseers. In Spanish, the word is mayordomo. I've done some presentations in Spanish with people who have migrated to the United States. And I use the term mayordomo for steward and mayordomia for stewardship. And someone raised their hand and just said, I just want you to know I would never, ever want to be considered a steward. Stewards were the overseers and the taskmasters on the basically the plantations that I worked on. So it's a very interesting development, for lack of a better term, that the church came to embrace the term stewardship. When you also even just look at the gospel stories, like the parable of the unjust steward, as well as the steward in the wedding of Cana. And Jesus is oftentimes presented as a foil to stewards.
Yeah, I noticed in your introduction you quoted from a Reinhold Niebuhr article I didn't know existed that asked the question, is stewardship ethical? What's your response to that?
Well, his point is that the church, mainline churches' love and fascination with the term stewardship is really from about the 1930s and the kind of managerial class kind of redevelopment of trying to think about how do we do wealth management and wealth stewardship within the church. And so that's what led to an embrace of the term. His point is that when we use the word stewardship, we're ignoring the long tradition that I kind of referenced earlier, which called people to think about sources of wealth particularly. Within the book of Sirach, for instance, there is this line that which says, wealth from rapine, as well as from taking food from the mouths of orphans and widows, that wealth should not ever be offered to God. So there's a long tradition which calls us to think about where are we getting our wealth, and we tend to not really emphasize that in our churches today. I'm speaking in generalities. Maybe y'all do, but my sense is that that's a conversation that we're only recently having a little bit more around reparations. It's been pretty long absent.
We have a lot of good questions that have already been submitted. One person notes that in the book you talk about partnering with organizations that address immediate hunger and systemic causes of hunger, and wondering if you have any specific recommendations in our community or elsewhere in terms of what those organizations might be.
Yes, I mean, I'm on the board of Episcopal Relief and Development, and so Rob Radke is here, and so I think first and foremost, Episcopal Relief and Development is an amazing organization which does work all around the globe.
I promise Rob didn't submit this question.
No, it's not. I am a fan because of their work, and also because of some of the innovative work that's being done, particularly around savings groups. I would say is really some of the exciting work. In New York, one group that I think is really interesting is the Coalition for the Homeless. So I say that because they work both on the advocacy side as well as service side. So as I'm sure all of you know, we have a major homelessness crisis. There are about 60,000 people in shelter system right now and 21,000 kids in that shelter system, and this is an affordable housing crisis at the end of the day. So Coalition for the Homeless does amazing work, and they're thinking both in terms of, classically in terms of the church, both service and advocacy.
If I can just put in a plug for Crossroads Community Services here at St. Bart's that is addressing immediate needs for hunger, and they partner with Coalition for the Homeless. So in supporting Crossroads, you're also supporting Coalition too. I think this is coming out of the stewardship model. Someone asks if you can comment on the importance of giving time and talent, no matter what your means are.
Yeah. Well, maybe I can just give a little context for myself. So through the writing of this book, actually, I started going more regularly and now fully at a small parish, San Andres, in Sunset Park, which is mostly Latino immigrant, Spanish-speaking parish. In terms of money, it's not a wealthy community. Plate and pledge is about $20,000 for the full total year. A little different context. But we give very generously in terms of time and talent. It's a place where the community comes together and cleans the church. People donated and reconstructed the entire back facade and stained glass windows. It is a place that gives very generously, and Father Francisco always says, if someone came into this parish and tried to steal tried to steal something, they wouldn't really find much to steal. But it is a rich congregation in terms of people, and that's the wealth of the community. So that is what I would, that time and talent is really important. One thing I always think about in terms of time, in terms of the Gospels, Jesus is constantly saying that there's not much time. It's actually, there's very little time. He's saying there's an urgency about time. So in terms of time, talent, and treasure, I always think it's kind of important to note that there's almost a little bit of scarcity in the Gospels around a sense of time, because God's kingdom is imminent, so we have to act now.
One person is asking a follow-up question about reparations. Do you think they're a helpful thing? This person wonders if by causing resentment they may be counterproductive. That framework, I guess.
Well, I think they're in the Gospels. The story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector, he says, if I have made any wealth unjustly, let me pay it back to the poor 4 times. So whether or not it causes resentment, I think it's there. And I think we have to wrestle with what that means.
Okay, this question says, there's a story, perhaps apocryphal, of Pope Innocent III showing St. Francis the Vatican Palace. Innocent said, "No longer can we say neither silver nor gold have we." And Francis replied, "Neither can we say in the name of Jesus of Nazareth, take up your pallet and walk."
Huh. Well, I guess I don't know that story, but it certainly sounds like Francis. Yeah.
I'm curious. You're the administrator of a seminary, academic institution, and these are not easy times for raising funds for institutions like St. Bart's or Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary. Do we have the luxury of thinking about where our wealth comes from if we're fighting to survive? Or do you see things differently?
I don't know if it's luxury. I think it's more of a call, and calls are hard. So I think we're called to do the hard thing and think about sources of wealth, and turn them outward. So the Basil of Caesarea in 4th century, I think, says that we are not called to be stewards of wealth, we are called to be stewards of humanity. And it's a slight shift, but I think it's a really important one. If, as leaders in an institution, we think our primary role is to maximize returns and, get the bigger fundraising, okay, but what are we doing with that? Are we turning it outward? Are we using it to alleviate debts of the poor? Are we using it to create a more just world? I think that's what Basil was formed both by, he was a bishop, so he was thinking about diocese, he was thinking about institutions, but he was also deeply formed by the ascetic tradition and kind of deep teachings around the social purposes of wealth. So his point was, he was preaching to the wealthy and saying, you have to take this wealth, it's potential medicine for the suffering of people, and we have to turn it outward and use it as medicine for people who are suffering. So that's how I think about it. It's, I think we can, per the parable of the Unjust Steward, use even unrighteous mammon and turn it outward, but I also think we have to handle it very carefully and think about it as something to be returned to marginalized communities.
One person wonders if you can reflect a little on kind of systemic inequality and the widening gap between the rich and the poor. How can and should we think about systemic change, including at the political level?
I'm not sure I'm going to speak directly to that. I think the thing that comes immediately to mind and the kind of personal route in which I've resolved this for myself. So Gustavo Gutierrez, who's kind of the founder and father of Latin American theology, he has a definition of solidarity, which I think is very important. He says solidarity is not necessarily about who you vote for. It's not about ideological solidarity. First and foremost, solidarity is about friendship with the poor. Do you know people's names? Do you know people's stories? Are you at people's weddings? Are you in friendship? Not with people who you're in outreach to, but actually in friendship. In terms of inequality, and the way that inequality separates us from each other, partly it's one of the reasons why I decided to go to San Andres is I realized that in my own journey, I was no longer in touch with people who were really struggling economically. That was not part of my day-to-day life. And so it was really important to live in friendship and in community with people who represented a very different economic story from ourselves. Both as a gay man, I'll say, go to a party. Oftentimes, the people in the room are very wealthy, very privileged. It takes a lot of effort to actually break out of that and form friendships and form community with people who are unlike you. And church is a place, certain churches are places where you can actually do that. And so I think that that's the kind of, that friendship is a response to the social inequality that this person is describing.
So is it fair to say that we shouldn't only be thinking about the issue from a systemic perspective? It's also about personal relationship.
I think it's personal relationship that then allows you to see the system more clearly. So oftentimes we speak about the poor in a very generalized way. And it's, actually you really need to know names. You really need to know stories. Those stories are more complicated than they're oftentimes described in the media. And it's from those relationships that then you can start to see systems more clearly. Here's the image that we're seeing is a perfect example. It takes visiting spaces, being in community. There's a wonderful Episcopal congregation out in North Fork, mostly of indigenous-speaking Latino community workers, to realize that a lot of folks are literally in debt. I mean, major debt, and are working out their debt through this labor that we see in front of us. Like, that's an economic story that I'm not sure how oftentimes that's told when we're talking about the lives of undocumented immigrants. So it's in kind of getting into proximity that you actually start to see those stories more clearly. And it is systemic then. But first there's relationship.
If you throw a stone in this neighborhood, you'll reach one of the major financial institutions in the country and in the world. If you had an opportunity to speak to one of the heads of those institutions, as someone who's just written a book on wealth and poverty, what would you say?
I would say that there's a deep tradition within both the Hebrew scriptures as well as Christian scriptures, New Testament, Old Testament, New Testament, and within the Christian tradition that really abhors predatory debt, and predatory lending, I should say, and the way in which predatory lending is a form of slavery of the poor. So Leviticus 25 really talks very specifically about how God is the God of freedom. God is the God who freed the Israelites out of Egypt. And therefore, because God is the God of freedom, we should not be engaging in predatory lending to others, because that sort of lending is a form of re-enslavement. So I would, that line is in Leviticus 25. Jesus in Luke 6, I believe, says that we should lend without interest. This really shapes the Christian tradition all the way through the Reformation. In the Council of Nicaea, clergy who were found to be engaging in predatory lending were deposed. We take it very, very seriously, and there's a reason why we take it very seriously. It's because lending at very high interest rates to people who are vulnerable is a form of entrapment, and it's exceptionally cruel, and it's a part of what our moral tradition pushes back against. So we've sort of forgotten it. And it's the norm for many of our financial institutions. I mean, well, I'm not going to name specific ones, but I have specific ones in my mind that were very involved in going into churches pre-2008 and getting mainly African-American Latinos to sign up for junk mortgages for which they were never able to repay. And it is unconscionable. I think those actions are unconscionable.
So we have to stop in just a moment. We're all going to go home and read your book, and if you don't have the book yet, it's in the bookstore. In the book, you talk about a lot of these major figures in early Christianity and their approach to economic issues. Besides you, if we had to read one other thinker from this period, which is the one you felt most drawn to and why?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I mean, just in terms of usefulness, and like the book that I just kept coming back to over and over again, the work of Helen Rhee, who's an early church historian, was just foundational. She has 2 books, and the names I always like confused, but she has 2 books on how the church thought about wealth and poverty. One is a compilation of many of these texts, and so you kind of read an introduction, and then you can actually read the texts themselves. And then she has another book, which is kind of an overview. They're very academic works, so I mean, hopefully I wrote this in a slightly more accessible way, but her work was absolutely foundational to everything that I wrote here. So I would recommend it.
Well, Miguel, thank you so much for being at the forum today.
Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure.
And thank you all for being here, whether in person or online. We hope you'll stick around and join us for worship at 11 a.m. Next week, the forum will be back with Akash Mehta, who is the editor-in-chief of a new journalism startup called New York Focus, and he'll be talking about some of the important issues going on in our city and state. Hope to see you then.